Ano ai me ke aloha kako. I'm Natalie, aloha. And that's Kaliko, and over there, Kaliko Kuola. Say aloha. This is I think this is my first presentation since COVID, but in person once. I've been very used to Zoom lately, and I hope it's not super boring, a PowerPoint, and it's probably hard for everyone to see, so I'll try to tell the story as much as possible. So today I'm going to talk about Ola Nā Kuaiwi, Ōiwi Agriculture from past to future. Next slide. So, a'o aku, a'o mai. So I just want to acknowledge that there's many ways of receiving knowledge and many ways of sharing knowledge. And so what I'm going to share with you today is just one perspective of what I've learned in my short lifetime. And I'm sure that I just want to recognize that there's so much other Ike in this room as well. And so this is just one perspective. Oh, and then I was going to do an activity. I was going to do like a little technological one, but we'll just do analog, since this feels like an analog type of place. Oh, I wanted to know, where does everyone call home? So who calls Waikoloa area home? Raise your hand. Okay, that's like a third-ish, fourth. Okay, Waimea. We got some Waimea peeps. Like Kohala, like Hawi, Kapa'au side. Oh, nice. And then Kona. You can vote more than once. Oh, I saw the struggle. Kona. Oh, that was a lot of Kona. Wait, try Kona again. There might be more Konas than Waikoloas. Cool. Okay, awesome. Mahalo for that. Getting to know each of you. Okay. Oh, Rob, can we pass out these Post-its or someone? So I have Post-its. If everybody could, and I have like 3 pens, which is probably not enough pens, but if you have a pen and Post-it, I want to know from you guys. There's pens up here if you want to borrow. The question is, I wrote it down in this little Mentimeter thing. What comes to mind when you think of an abundant Waikoloa? What comes to mind when you think of an abundant Waikoloa? Yeah. So you could do like one word, you could draw a picture, you could do whatever you want, and then just come put it up here when you're power. It's okay. Mahalo for participating. If you don't want to, it's totally fine too. So we have people talking. A lot of people mention Willy Willy, like abundant Waikoloa to them means lots of Willy Willy everywhere and their friends. Abundant native flora and fauna, sunshine, Mauka to Makai, Nene. Happy students. Thank you. Rocks, birds. Oh no! Oh! Rain, environmental awareness. These are the worst Post-its ever. Plenty of home gardens. Biodiversity, less goats. Probably more walking spaces.
Yeah, it's fewer, not less.
Oh, Pete corrected, it's fewer goats grammatically. Grammar police. Natural resources to provide life. Oh, it's having natural selection. Okay, mahalo. Oh my gosh, sorry. Thank you, Hule. Okay, that's awesome. I think there's a lot of themes around. You guys are definitely like environmental people. Conservation of aina and culture, enough for all, many opportunities. It's good, thank you. Okay, mahalo. I think
there's 2 different stories.
Bridget's on it. Sorry.
Double them up.
Oi. Okay.
Double them up. There's always one.
Yeah, they can just. Okay, mahalo. Mahalo for participating. So I think just yeah, learning from each of you of like what your vision is for the future and what you see of this place. Mahalo for putting that on this pai today. So today we're going to focus on just a quick overview of Ōiwi or Native Hawaiian agriculture. Share some of the research I've done of the traditional Hawaiian agricultural footprint, the productive capacity and future potential into the future. I said that. And then examples of an adaptive reuse project in Kahalu'u, Kona. So Polynesians arrived in Hawaii with 23 crops. They probably took more than 23 crops on board with them, but 23 crops were established successfully in Hawaii. And this is really important because the native flora of Hawaii, none of our native plants are able to be dietary staples. There's not enough carbohydrates or protein in them. And when these voyagers got to Hawaii, they weren't, oh no, you're good. Next slide. When they got to Hawaii, they weren't Hawaiian. They were Marquesan or Tahitian perhaps, from other places. And what made them Hawaiian was their continuous interactions with this place. And over time, they developed our kupuna developed really sophisticated and intimate relationships with this place. And through this interaction, there were worldviews and religion and things that permeated society, values that permeated society and were just a part of all life. And so two values I want to bring up here are mo'okuahau, genealogy or continuity, and aloha, which one definition could be reciprocity. And so from a Kanaka Ōiwi worldview, right, as Kanaka, we are genealogically related to all the plant people, all the animal people, all of the weather phenomena, all the ocean people. We are descended from them, and they're a part of us. And so because of that, we are inherently required to treat all of those elements of our surroundings with reciprocity. And so we take and give in kind like you would a grandmother or a grandfather. And so these really important concepts weren't just here and there in society. This was permeated throughout all of Hawaiian society. It was ingrained in institutions like religion and law, like kapua and kanawai. And then through these relationships, next please, there was also development of management or stewardship systems over time. There were specific ways to manage aina, specifically to that fit Hawaii. And so some examples are managing from the moku, the island scale, to the ahupua'a or kalana in Waikoloa and Waimea's case, all the way down to the kihapai level of management. And each of those land divisions had a specific ali'i or governance structure that was tied to that land division at different scales. And then from Mauka to Makai is usually how those divisions go. But there was also land divisions that went horizontally across the aina called Vau, which you might be familiar with. And in Kona, there's a cool one, Vau Lama. So the zone of the lama trees. So you can just imagine that there was all different kind of vau, very specific to place, and not all ahupua'a were the same. But then we get these pictures that really show ahupua'a as the same. That's not the point of this. The point of this picture was that when you look at the general ahupua'a poster, there are many elements that are part of the Ōiwi food system. So even though today we're only going to talk about agriculture, like land-based food production, there were so many other ways or so many other elements of the Hawaiian food systems, from the forest, some of the mountains to the deep fisheries, the nearshore fisheries, the fish ponds, the streams, and the diversity on land. Next slide. And I just want to acknowledge some of those that we're not going to cover today, but are really important to this area in Waikoloa, as well as North Kona, Kekahavai Ole. Fish ponds, very abundant here. I think I read today that Kalahui Pua'a has 11 fish ponds. And then ankle-line pools, there's numerous across North Kona, South Kohala. And the opaiula, the endemic red shrimp that live in these ankle-line pools, were actually used as prize bait in this area to catch opelu. So it's a really important part of the fishery as well. And so when you have opelu, then you can catch the bigger fish, and so on and so forth. So, and ankle-line pools, if you're not familiar, are brackish water ponds at the coast, and it's really specific to like the younger geology, so Hawaii Island and Maui for Hawaii. And so it's really important to understand like that Mauka-Makai connection, because they really sit at that interface. And then Pa'akai, you know, kupuna of this area, this is Auntie Lei, Keakea Lenny Leitner, Auntie Ku'ulei's auntie. I think he had Auntie Ku'ulei last month or last time. And so their ohana built local pa'akai, where you use coral mortar to make waterproof sealant on pohaku, and then filled it with salt water and gathered salt from that. And that was really important for trading as well, and for preserving food. Yeah, no, you're good. Yeah, just move me along. I was like not even supposed to go that deep in that. Okay, so when we talk about Ōiwi agriculture, yes, food is an important component and an important product, but there's all these other products like or beverages, medicine, lighting, construction, cordage, clothing. Tea leaf has, you know, la'i has so many different uses. It was basically like a Tupperware. You wrapped everything in tea leaf, or aluminum foil. You could call it that too. Okay. And so, just wanted to go over some of these I'm going to go over three major agricultural systems. The first being lo'i. So Kanaka Ōiwi created these lo'i in wetland terraces in areas of water abundance in alluvial plains, mostly in the older valleys of islands. And they were created earlier in Hawaiian history, and they were built out to the largest scale when compared to other places around Polynesia. And as you know, lo'i is based upon kalo. Although on the banks of lo'i, it was intercropped with many different species, including native species. Go ahead. And lo'i is an example of eco-mimicry. And so I wrote a bunch of notes today and then I forgot at home. So this is like, don't quote me on this. You can go read the paper about eco-mimicry. But eco-mimicry is a form of environmental engineering that understood like the cultural landscape and the biodiversity, and engineered these new solutions in response to rising populations. And so this is termed an eco-mimicry system because Kanaka would kind of go into areas that have high water abundance and widen on an alluvial plain or a wetland and make it into a lo'i. And then what we found is that some native water birds actually don't appear in the fossil record in a lot of places in Hawaii until after the establishment of lo'i. So like creating these systems actually served a lot of co-benefits of increasing biodiversity. And as you know, so many of our water birds today, our native water birds, are endangered. And then recently I went to an HCC presentation by a graduate student named Bryn Weber, and she actually studied the nesting success of alaiula, the coot that's endangered in a refuge in Honolulu versus a lo'i in Honolulu. And she actually found there's no difference in nesting success. So a lo'i serves just as much the biodiversity function as a refuge in terms of nesting success. And it's producing food at the same time, and it's involving community, right? And it's people practicing culture. And refuges cost a lot of money. So this is just another way to think about these co-benefits. Another cool thing about, oh, sorry, go back to Lo'i, please. Another cool thing about Lo'i is it's been also shown that Lo'i can reduce sedimentation by 90% in some places. So because of the terracing, it's constantly catching sediment and depositing in the Lo'i, which actually is helping the nutrients when you're farming, and then decreasing all of that going out into the ocean. And so as as our floods get more intense with climate change, this is really important. And then that's the stopping of the flooding actually also increases recharge. So there's more freshwater recharge as well. So all of these co-benefits of this eco-mimicry of Lo'i, which is pretty amazing. And so Nā Kuaiwi also engineered this second system I'm going to talk about, dryland or rain-fed agriculture. Sometimes in Hawaiian, it'll be called mala or ulula'au. It kind of depends on the place. And this system was developed later in Hawaiian history, and it's usually on the leeward sides of younger islands. So these younger substrates like Kona and Ka'u and Kohala supported these really vast systems, basically all the uplands of Kona, and a lot of leeward Kohala and Ka'u. And this system was mainly based upon sweet potato or uwala, but there was many different crops intercropped, natives as well. So you kind of, in some places, it was even an agroforestry system, like in Kona. I can talk more about that as we go. Oh, and it's really characterized by, I don't know if you can see the picture, but it's really characterized by archaeology, cultural sites that have field border walls, where you have border walls and the plantings were in the middle, like called the kihapai. Yeah. And what's interesting that you might be familiar with the Kohala field system. That's a lot of research has gone on, and what's interesting is that the kupuna of Kohala were really farming this sweet spot of soil fertility. So you can see, I don't know if you can see, but there's an outline right here of where the field system exists according to archaeology. And they sampled soils across that gradient and found that above where the field system is, the nutrients actually decrease really rapidly. And that's because the rainfall is super high in that part of the mountain. And because it's so high, all of the good nutrients is really leached from the soil. And so that's not, it doesn't support good agriculture. And then on the Makai side, you can see again, the nutrients really drop off. And that's a function of the substrate being really young and not enough rainfall. So it hasn't had time for nutrients to get into the soil yet. So the kupuna of Kohala and other places were really farming that sweet spot of soil fertility, which is pretty ingenious. And then the third system I'm going to talk about today is agroforestry. So agroforestry is a multi-crop extensive system. Some people call it like food forest or permaculture, where there's a multi-story crop. So there's trees, you could have native trees, you could have banana and ulu and all kinds too. And then middle story species like ava, or if you had like some natives in there, it could be like a'ali'i or a'veoveo in the middle, tea leaf. And then at the bottom, you have all your ground covers and your root crops like kalo, and then other root crops as well. And this system that we mapped occurred in the slopes. It's called colluvial slopes of older islands. So in the slope, it would occur above a lo'i. That's where this type of agroforestry would happen. And so, next slide. And what's cool about agroforestry is you can see it really is mimicking this forest structure. Farming was, or the way that these systems were designed was really to mimic a native forest structure. So you have a native forest up here and an agroforest down here. And so having all of that multi-storied diversity really helps to, conserve water, increase moisture retention. There's just there's windbreaks, there's pest control because it's so diverse at multiple scales. And I think that's the next slide. And so agroforestry is kind of like this really interesting, and I just going into detail on agroforestry a little bit because it's less known than the other systems, that these systems are really important because they're demonstrated systems of resilience, and it's usually because they're diverse at multiple levels. So on the crop level, you might have 50 varieties of one crop. So it's diverse at that crop level. And then at the farm level, you could have all these different crops interspersed. And then at the landscape level, agroforestry systems also protect forest areas in patches. So if you looked from a bird's eye view, it'd be very patchy, where you'd have crops and forests interspersed. And so this can really serve to preserve biodiversity outside of formerly protected areas. Because as we know in Hawaii, almost half of our lands are not in conservation, right? Most of them are in agriculture land use. And so restoration of these systems today could be really important in working to include native plants and other with food crops in order to increase the area we can do conservation. Okay, so any questions? Sorry, I should say, like, you can ask a question whenever you want. Didn't mean it to be. I should make everyone like drink a sip of beer. And,
How much of the start of native Hawaiian agriculture was trial and error versus things that were already known from Polynesian landscapes that they then used here?
I don't know the correct answer to that, but my thoughts are, so a lot of these techniques are found in other places in Polynesia, so agroforestry for sure and lo'i were definitely something that was brought with them. But I think for lo'i, the literature says that it was developed to a higher form, the highest form here, like where it was more expansive and more effort was put into it than anywhere else. And kalo really rose as a staple crop. In other places in Polynesia, kalo is not the staple crop. Like in other places, some people value like the yam like as their highest staple crop. And so maybe their aina is the best to farm, the best yams. and Hawaii's valleys, really catered to that alluvial farming. And then for dryland agriculture, so the sweet potato, uala, wasn't actually brought to Hawaii until after Hawaiians had already settled here. So Polynesian voyagers went to South America and brought it back to Polynesia. And so it was kind of, I would think that, when uala was brought to all these places across the Pacific, they kind of developed it in tandem, their own way of farming uala. And then there's there's very, very specific styles of planting that are like you only see in one place, because that place, like for example, at a site I'm going to show, has a pohoihoi blister, and so water collects there and doesn't seep from the ground. And so they made like planting rings, like kind of like a floating lo'i out of rocks and then kind of filled with mulch. And that's, because they had a lot of rocks there, and because that pohoihoi blister is there, and because the weather pattern has a seasonal heavy rainfall time and a more dry time. So that's just an example of, being very specific and adapting to place in those micro habitats. Yeah. Does anyone else have a question? Okay. So I probably should have said that. Okay, so those three agricultural systems that I showed, lo'i, dryland, and agroforestry, you'll see some maps. And what we did was we used a spatial model, and we took all these different environmental parameters like rainfall, like distance from stream, like temperature, elevation as a proxy of temperature, and we built these models of where would these systems exist in the past, because we don't have good information of where all of these systems have existed in the past, because things have changed so much now, and water, rainfall, everything has shifted so much that it's hard to even know where this agriculture existed, and thus where we could restore it today, right? So you'll see on the map blue, red, and green representing lo'i, dryland, and agroforestry respectively. So we built these models, and it seems really simple with the click of the side, but it took like a really long time, and then it outputs it on the map, and you can see that it's probably hard to see from back there, but you know, the lo'i and agroforestry areas were concentrated on the older islands, the older valleys, and then the dry land was mapped on the younger leeward sides of younger islands. And the model identified 250,000 acres of indigenous agricultural systems across the state. And this is important because for some land managers, it might be a good way for people to say like, okay, this traditionally was in this type of agriculture, and we don't have, you know, a lot of communities don't have the resources to go out and do an archaeological survey of even 1 acre is really expensive. So this model helps people identify areas where these systems existed and maybe where they should start restoration. And then we tried to match the models up with archaeological evidence and ethnohistoric evidence. So we took the models and then we looked at the existing archaeological data and the ethnohistoric data, so interviews, oral histories, things like that. And it matches up pretty well. It's probably really hard to see, but this is Honolulu Valley on the north shore of Oahu. And this middle slide picture is of an archaeological survey from the 70s, and it matches up almost perfectly with what the model shows. And so you can just think that it's pretty correct for the rest of the aina. And we did do like a pretty detailed validation process. And there's some areas that didn't match up that I can talk about later. And then from there, what we did was we have this model that says like, okay, this is how much acres you see in lo'i, this is how much acres you'd see in dryland, and this is how much acres you'd see in agroforestry. And then you can calculate using understanding fallow and understanding production, how much food was being produced from this land. And so we actually found that these agricultural lands were likely producing over 1 million metric tons of food per year. And this is interesting because it's really comparable to the current amount of food that Hawaii consumes, 1.14 million. So very similar numbers. And then, so you can take those production numbers and then you can kind of estimate how many people was that feeding potentially. And we use a super conservative 3,000 calorie day diet. So if these people were eating 3,000 calories, one person was eating 3,000 calories per day, and it was only these land-based carbohydrates, not including like meat from, you know, chickens and pigs, and then also no protein from the ocean, and then 1 million people could be supported. Yes.
I'm sorry. The spatial model you built and the calculations that are from, that assumes that everything that was, or your calculations seem to be based on the assumption that everything that could be farmed was farmed.
Yeah, so it does take into account fallow. So if you go back one,
Right.
So
but if there's 100,000 acres of agroforest, that doesn't mean that all 100,000 acres actually was agroforest.
yeah, so the
Capable of supporting.
yes, so the theoretical carrying capacity potentially supported, and it doesn't want to give like a specific date and time when all of this was farmed, but I think from ethnohistorical evidence, you can imagine that there was a point in time when most of the land was maxing out its potential, because you can see some of agriculture or archaeological, the way they have chronological studies of Ōiwi walls going over one another in Kohala, for example, and you can actually map out how these systems were getting built out and getting smaller and smaller and smaller because the population was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they needed to farm more and more and more within that footprint. And like the Kohala example, right? They kind of expanded across that entire footprint. But there's a lot of caveats. Aurora Kagawa did like a seasonality study to show that, you know, this that's just an average. What we showed is just an average production per year. But of course, it varied year to year, right? Depending on weather and other things. Yeah. Yes, and it doesn't take into account spoilage and ho'okupu, you know, to offerings as taxes and things like that. So even though it's conservative, it's also, maybe it balances itself out. If that makes sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else have a question? Okay. I kind of forget. What's the next slide? Oh, and then just looking at Hawaii Island, sorry, I can go back one. You know, like we talked about, the majority of the food was coming from these 3 major field systems, and then the other huge part of food production was coming from the windward valleys, like Waipi, Waimanu, you know, the windward Kohala and northern Hamakua valleys. But this model, I want to point out, right, isn't showing all of the agriculture that happened. We just modeled the 3 main systems. And so it misses a lot. There was definitely, it misses things that were being farmed in a different way. So in Puna, there's nothing here, but we know that the people of Puna were actually like planting in the forest. There's like ulu groves in the forest. There was ava being planted in trees and ikaha ferns. And the model isn't built to pick those kinds of things up. So just to acknowledge that there's so many other ways that we know people were farming that were also really important as well.
Was each island self-sufficient? Was it, or was it meant to be shared across islands?
My understanding is that the moku was the sustainable like unit that you would kind of, everything you needed would be within your moku and not necessarily within your ahupua'a. And so I think if things were being managed well and yeah, I think that there would be sustainability at that level, if not at the island scale.
Your map didn't show any agriculture on Hilo either.
Yeah, there's like a tiny little bit of like blues in there with these really little valleys, but yeah, there's like for, I think for, yeah, we know that there was really huge kind of like more like swampland type of lo'i in Hilo, and I think the model doesn't pick it up because the model is based upon like alluvial soil. So where was alluvial soil specifically deposited in those areas? And I think those are more like are a different kind of soil, and that's why it's not being picked up. Does that make sense?
And then when I look at this, is that the lo'i and then the dry land and then the agro?
Yes. Oh, sorry, I didn't put my legend. I forgot to add that. Yes. So the dry land is the red, lo'i is blue. It's so faint. The other islands are easier to see because they have much more lo'i systems because they're older. And then agroforestry is shown up here around the lo'i systems of Kohala. But what we mapped was just this one type of agroforestry called colluvial agroforestry. And there's actually other types of agroforestry going on all around Hawaii. So I don't want to confuse anybody.
What's the green, like, what is that, chain of craters?
Yeah, so that's I don't want to say error, but an interesting mismatch of the model that was identifying that area as agroforestry. I'm pretty sure there's no agroforestry in that area. But it's probably picking up that that area has colluvial slope soil. So the way the soil is eroding off of a slope, it has enough nutrients to support that type of agriculture is what it's saying. Yeah. Okay, so then this is just the numbers for Hawaii Island. You probably can't see, but it's saying that the carrying capacity, according to the model, is 473,000 people. And the current consumption, I have the wrong. I think actually the current population is around 183,000 people. And then the production was about 400,000 metric tons per year, and the current consumption in Hawaii Island is 186,000. So about half, as we're consuming half as much as this island potentially could have supported in the past. Okay. Okay. And I thought this was the fun part today when I was preparing this, was that I was thinking like, okay, Waikoloa, I don't know that much about this place. And so I kind of was trying to do some research and thinking about like, I was trying to look into the documents and say like, okay, what kind of agriculture was, being done here that's not being picked up by the model? Like, what are the special ways these people were farming? And it's actually really interesting. There's not much information about agriculture in this area. You can go to the next slide. The main farming system was in this pink area. It's called the Waimea field system. So it was kind of on the other map, it was connected to the Kohala field system, but there was a field system that occurred right kind of like in the footprint of Waimea town in this pink area. And Waikoloa Ili is another thing I learned. I think Auntie Ku'ule kind of touched upon it last time. This Waikoloa is actually an ili of Waimea Kalana. So Waimea is not an ahupua'a, it's a kalana. It's a division that's bigger than an ahupua'a. And within Waimea Kalana, there's actually 8 ilis, Waikoloa being one, Lalamilo being another, Ōiwi being another. And so those 8 ilis, Pu'ukapu being this one on the top, were a part of Waimea Kalana. And I read, these two are Kauai. And I actually read that from Lion in Kamehameha Schools' master's thesis, that people considered that Waimea Kalana as separate from Kohala. It wasn't a part of Kohala. It wasn't a part of the Kohala moku. It was its own thing. And that there's 2 other places in Hawaii that kind of are like that. In Lahaina, Lahaina wasn't considered part of that moku of Maui, and Navai'eha, those 4 major watered valleys in Maui, was considered its own thing, not part of its moku, which I thought was pretty interesting. And so you can kind of think about this Kalana of Waimea being its own like kind of self-sustaining unit. So I was thinking like, yeah, like what was the major agriculture of this place and how is it supporting these people? And I knew of the Waimea field system, but what's interesting, or I think I can put a map. This is just the streets of Waimea town, and so you can just see the coverage, but it basically is Mauka of town, and then all of Lalamilo is included, and all of these like archaeological features run underneath town and was supporting this field system. And what's interesting that wouldn't be picked up by the model completely is that this field system was actually semi-flooded. So there were so it was a dryland system, which was rain-fed most of the time, but they built Ōiwi that tapped into an intermittent stream. So when the stream had enough water, it would flow into these Ōiwi and semi-flood the fields, and there was no ho'iwai. It wouldn't go back into a stream like a regular lo'i, but it would just flow and water the fields when there was enough water. And it was a really special way of farming. You can go to the next slide. And so this is a figure from Kamehameha Plunkett. He's a kupa of Waimea, and this is his master's thesis, but this is a stream, and then he made a map of, these are all branches of the Ōiwi feeding all of these different fields, and this is the Lalamilo area. Like I think Anna's ranch is like over here. Next. And then, you probably can't see this all, but there's all these field borders underneath the grasslands of Waimea, where you can still see the infrastructure of all of these field systems in Waimea. And these people did a LiDAR survey and mapped the fields, McIver and Lotta Foged, but they said that while other intermittent irrigation systems have been recorded in Hawaii, none exhibit the technical sophistication, geographic extent, and intensity level represented by the complex system of ditches and terraces found in Waimea. So it's really a special, unique system developed here. In this, it does go into the ili of Waikoloa. So the Smalco reaches include this field system. This is kind of boring. Basically, so we know that these systems could have the potential to feed many people. They were productive and they were efficient. But what does that mean today, given that we're already experiencing climate change, right? We're one of the most developed Pacific islands. And so what we did was to do all those models, but under 3 different climate change scenarios into the future. And basically what we found, you don't have to look at the screen. Basically what we found that is even in the driest scenarios, the driest and the hottest scenarios, there is still a lot of potential for production in these systems and restoration. And that a lot of these systems are going to shift into the conservation zone. But most of the land does remain agriculture. So most of the model is showing that these traditional agricultural systems are zoned agriculture. And so we don't have, there's not a lot of regulatory boundaries to doing restoration in them today. And then even into the future, if they do move into the conservation zone, we can look at restoration of these systems in those areas because they do integrate native species. They do involve community, and a lot of the lowland conservation zone areas right now, we're not paying attention to them as land managers because it's super expensive to do restoration in those areas. They're highly invaded. They're not, I don't want to say pristine, but like the high quality. I hate to say the forest is, not quality, but that managers don't want to focus on because it's too expensive. But this could be, funding or promoting or incentivizing traditional practices in agriculture and agroforestry in these conservation zones of low priority could be a method to get both biodiversity wins and also, food benefits, cultural benefits, community benefits, and so forth, and all those other co-benefits that I talked about in the beginning. Okay, you could just pass this. I kind of just talked about. Oh, and then you can take those climate change models and you can lay them all upon one another, and it makes this map. And this is showing you the areas that are most resilient to climate, all different types of climate change into the future. All the different scenarios of climate change are saying these areas will still be good to restore into the future. So this is a map that we can give policymakers and land managers to really prioritize areas. Okay. Okay. Okay, so yeah, in conclusion, but there's more, I'm sorry. Pre-colonization, Ōiwi agriculture was highly productive, it was efficient, it was supporting large populations, and that most of these areas are still zoned agriculture, even with urban development and climate change. There's a lot of potential to pursue restoration. And there's an opportunity to look to these systems that we know are climate resilient because of, their heterogeneity and diversity at multiple scales. In these low priority conservation areas for greater food self-sufficiency and biodiversity conservation. Yay. Okay. And then I just have this part's fun. It would just be pictures of just an example of restoration in Hawaii. So what does restoration of these systems look like? And this one specifically part of the Kona field system. Kahalu'ukuahewa is the largest portion of the traditional Kona field system. It's up Donkey Mill Road. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Donkey Mill Road, but it was rediscovered in 2003. This land was actually leased for coffee, and then they wanted to get a USDA grant, and they got an archaeological survey, and over 4,000 archaeological features were discovered. So I don't know if you can see this map, but this is about 400 acres. Each of those yellow lines is a Kuaiwi wall that runs Mauka to Makai. And if you can see this picture, these walls can be really high or about this high. It's such a unique, beautiful place. There are planting mounds. You think you can go to the next one? That's an example of some of the deflated planting mounds before restoration. And those are, so the planting mounds are the really characteristic part of the Kona field system. So you'd have those Ōiwi walls that run Makai, like I was talking about. And then we'd have those planting mounds where like uala and other crops were planted in. And then there's really unique features in this. Oh wait, should I go back one? Oh, there's really unique features in this system as well. These are Hawai. So you think of Hawai as a lo'i system, a ditch, but of taking water from a stream and putting it into a lo'i. But here we have multiple Hawai features throughout the system that was really used to funnel like sheet rain and sheet water that was coming through the system and funnel it into a specific field. It's not a very common feature, very unique. This is some pictures of before and after restoration. You can come look at it after if you can't see, sorry. It's super amazing. Jesse and Kim Ko'one are caretakers up there now, just farming trying to create a demonstration site where you know, people can come and see like this is what the Kona field system might have looked like in the past, and recognize that this is in their own backyard. And I think oftentimes they'll say like, this is your cost. This was the Kanaka Costco back in the day. You know, this is where people went to get food, and this stretched the entire coffee belt of Kona. And think about that and take that back home. And so it's hopefully serving that purpose. Today. And this is that unique system I was talking about with the question where that pahoehoe blister holds water sometimes of the year. And there's these like rock pu'e structures. We call them makalua. That you can plant kalo in and then probably seasonally put other crops when it dries out. Oh, you can just, I didn't know I had animation. Oh, you can put it on. Yeah, that's good. So some of the outcomes, I don't know if everybody cares about this kind of stuff, but maybe Rob does. We have a 15-acre pig-proof fence. I've been doing research there since 2011, so I guess 10 years, but we've had restoration for the last 6 years. So 15-acre pig-proof fence, 5 acres has been hand-cleared, and it's actually a lot considering we can't use machinery, you know, with all these archaeological sites. We have 1.5 full-time staff, the husband and wife duo. And then they've outplanted 34 species, the majority being Polynesian introductions because it is an agricultural system. But I wanted to note that 40% of the outplanted species are native. And then when you look at the Polynesian introduced species, 63 of those were, there's 63 different traditional varieties. So even though you could say we had, you know, kalo, mai'a, uala, within those crops themselves, there are many, many varieties that are being kept there and stored there and grown and given to community. And then they've really ramped up community engagement, and they held 36 community work days last year, which is super amazing, especially like in the face of COVID. Yeah, and so this is my last slide. I know you're probably like, get it over with. I think I just wanted to say that, you know, thinking back to the beginning of the talk, I talked about this worldview that permeated society and the governance structures that were specifically developed to this place. And then, you know, we can understand where these systems existed. We can understand their potential. We can even relearn how to planting techniques and the weather patterns and learn how to soil build again. But really, if we're talking about restoration, we have to think about it at those multiple scales. Like, we're going to need institutional change and institutional structures that truly support not just the biodiversity component of this or the cultural component, but the system of food production and the system that connect people to place. And that it can't just be one person believing this or us in this room believing this. It has to be something that permeates society, where all of us see ourselves as the environment, and that aina is us and we are aina, and we can't have one without the other. And those are just the things I've been thinking about lately, that, you know, we really have to attack this issue at multiple scales. And you as community members, and probably like you seem really like eleu people who will come to something on Friday night. You know, you can support bills and talk to your senators and your council people, and you can go to volunteer days and spread the word. And then on a personal level, right? Like, you can think about what you see for this place and internalize it and carry that with you every day. And I'll just end there. Mahalo. Oh, Zach has a question.
I have a couple questions.
Oh,
Put you on the spot. So, you know, I work in the forestry side of things.
yes.
You know, those ag systems in Kohala and Waipi have been documented for a long time, and they support 1 million people.
Yeah.
What impact pre-contact were Hawaiians having on the extent of the forest in that period? You know, how big of a footprint is that? It's one question I had. But the other is, do you see some of those, you know, historical land uses like those awa being an option for future restoration where it puts that water back onto the landscape, puts that sediment back onto the landscape without the need for irrigation, like pump irrigation, like wells?
I think you answered your own second question, because that would be awesome.
I mean, is that a possibility? But, you know, there's almost like waterworks nowadays about stream.
Yeah.
But going back to that system, using water when it's there and not using it when it's not.
I think it would be amazing on, like, you know, those nature-based solutions from the environmental perspective, right? But even from the regulatory perspective, CWRM, the Commission of Water Resource Management, the state's Commission of Water Resource, have been making a lot of decisions lately to return water back to streams for one purpose being to feed you know, traditional farming systems again. And that's because it's in our constitution and traditional customary practices that you know, people have rights to water for that purpose. So I think it could even be an avenue to get that water back in that way. That was the easier question. The first question was, so there's actually a study about, so his question was about the impact of developing these systems what was the impact to the native forests. There's a study, the Sam Gon guys mapped the footprint pre-human, and then with Hawaiians, and then post-contact, and they were able to kind of model like and quantify forest or native system degradation. I think I can't remember the exact numbers, don't quiz me, but I think it was like on the order of like 10% of like altering when that Hawaiian footprint came on, and then when it was like post-contact, it was like magnitudes higher, right? Like 60% transformation, or even more, maybe like 80%. And like the examples I've seen in the forests, when we look at the field system infrastructure, like the Ōiwi walls, they don't actually stop when you reach the forest boundary. They'll actually go into the forest and they kind of just like peter off. And it was kind of like a continuum. So it wasn't like how we see today as like ag zone and conservation zone. It was an ag zone that melded into the forest zone. And there was actually like wild, you know, cultivation where you're not actually like intensively farming, but you're taking care, you would go take care of this plant like a little bit, and you would take care of this plant in that area. And then you would have like wild harvest more up. So they were still interacting in that whole space on that continuum. And I think that's an important difference when you compare it to like full-blown chain dragging for a pasture establishment. Yes. I'll send you the paper. Okay, and you had a question.
What was the name of that area that you were just talking about at the end?
Oh, yeah. Kahalu'u Kuahava. They have a great website. Kahalu'u Kuahava. Kahalu'u Kuahava. Website, Instagram.
Own that now?
Yes, we own this area, and yeah, we fund and support the management of this area. And some others, Puanui is another great example in Kohala where they're restoring the field system. They have work days. We work Kohala, that's a Kamehameha Schools land and program as well. Oh, yes. Aloha.
You were talking about zoning and zoning between conservation, zoning and agricultural. There's probably some nuance to your answer, but would you say that in the right hands it's more advantageous to have this kind of land zoned as ag because there's more flexibility, or is it more advantageous to be zoned as conservation land so that it's preserved forever?
I think from a management, because put my manager hat on, from a management perspective, it's way easier for it to be zoned ag, because yeah, you don't, so much less when zone conservation, you have to do like permits to build a fence. You have to do you have to ask permission to do conservation a lot of the time. But in ag areas, you can build roads without a permit, bring machinery on, bring soil in at high levels. But on the flip side, agricultural land is one of the most threatened, especially in Hawaii for development, right? So that's the first land that is going to get converted into urban and rural zoned. And that's happened, I have stats in my paper, but that's happened a lot in Hawaii in the past 30 years, as you guys probably know. So I don't know, that's a hard question. From a management perspective, ag, but then from like a preservation perspective, but maybe there's an in-between, if you were dreaming big, there could be like another zone that was preserved, but for the purpose of like traditional agri-restoration or something like that, where you could it was open to doing certain things for stewardship, but that it was required to stay in that land use into the future.
I think there is already, it just doesn't get adopted. There's 4 different classifications of conservation.
Oh, yeah.
One being resource, which you're supposed to be able to use and cultivate, but it's all treated the same as really strict conservation as well.
Maybe we gotta I don't know what we have to do about that.
That's awesome to know. That's, mainly my question was about where to advocate when you're going and advocating or supporting some things. So it's good to know that there's some variation in the conservation category.
Yeah, like most of forest reserves are resource zone conservation, but none have ever been successfully harvested and what they're intended for, because it's all treated the same.
Thank you, Zach. Oh, I think, did you have a question? Oh, okay, good.
I was just like, it seems like there needs to be like some kind of hybrid.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we can have to make it so you can conserve it, but then also be able to blend in some of the agriculture traditional things with conservation.
I think there actually was a bill that passed that was specifically focused on this. But then, yeah, bills and legislation in place versus practice, has a disconnect, building 30-story, telescopes in a conservation zone is also allowed. So it's confusing. Oh, yes, sir.
So I'm curious, what is your job exactly? I mean, what do you do?
That's a good question. No. It is a hard question for me. So I'm technically a resource manager for Kamehameha Schools, but so some of the projects I work on, I'll manage, Kahalu Kohava, for example, I'll manage a contract. So the majority of my job, I manage contracts. So we'll find vendors or community members to perform a service on our lands, and then we'll pay and manage them. And so sometimes we'll write the whole scope of work and make sure that management is done in this way. Other times it's more collaborative between community, what we both want for that place. And then I also work on strategic projects, like we did a carbon study for the organization, looking at how much we're sequestering and how much carbon emissions we're creating, things like that. I work on a marine strategy, so trying to figure out what is KS's role in the marine space, things like that. It's super random.
Wow.
Yes.
Natalie, can you speak to the functionality of the Kuleana walls? Practically, what did they do? What purpose did they serve?
Yeah. I think it was different in different places, but one of the main things is to, in Kona, I think it was about some of it was about water, about you know, catching that water that's in the air, because there is like a fog, like a rain fog thing going on, and funneling that water like Makai. And then some of it is about, like in Kohala, windbreaks, and Ka'u, because it's so windy. Some of it is about I think dividing property, because when you look at some of the older maps and Mahale documents, like the Kuaiwi walls will line up with certain ili. So there was different families taking care of different kihapai. And some of it, I don't know. Like in Kealia, we have walls that run north-south and not Makai. And so certain things were going on in that environment. I'm not familiar enough with that place to think about it. And then sometimes it was like clearing a field. They just started to clear, there's so much rocks everywhere that you would clear a field like with another pile of rocks, where there was a natural outcropping. And so that's kind of where the Kuaiwi started to form. And then the Kuaiwi were also like planted upon. There was like all kinds of crops that would, so the Kuaiwi would also be utilized as planting space. Oh, and then there's Kuaiwi that have pits in it, where it's like you go, and like in Keoho, there's like a thick wall, and then there's a hole inside of this Kuaiwi wall that was being planted like a pot. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm curious around, it seems like it was a thriving agricultural system for so long, and thinking about soil fertility and the tendency to have decline. Wondering if you can speak to the methods that were innovative for maintaining that.
For soil health, yes. Oh yeah, the soil that's one of the biggest challenges with restoration now, especially with a lot of these invasives. The soil is so depleted over not being managed for like 100 years. But some of the traditional practices around soil management, a lot of them focus on mulching. So you'll read about like a ma'u zone, the ma'u fern zone, and a ma'u was like one of the main, in Kona, one of the main mulch species. Kukui as well, you know, fast growing, drops choke leaves. Ko, it was also a huge mulch species. There's pakukui. I don't know if you guys have heard of pakukui style of planting, where they would dig a hole like, I don't know, 10 feet wide and 10 feet deep, like really, or 6 feet deep, and just fill it with a whole, like just put a whole kukui tree inside, like just cut up a whole tree. And then it was like when it decayed enough, you would like stick a stick in, and if it went like this far, then it was ready for planting. Stuff like that. I know Jesse has experimented with burning. I think some people did, you know, spot burn, not clear forest burn. What else? And I think like that multi-storied structure in general just serves to, you know, really, it naturally includes the litter cycle of those plants, so that there's constantly like that layer of humus going on. And then fallow was super important too. Because the root crops are constantly taking out the nutrients, you know, from that spot. So to make sure you're fallowing, especially for kalo, for a certain amount of time before you go back. Okay. I'm sure there's other things. Yeah. Yeah, you can talk. Well, I'll be over there. Yeah, you can ask me questions. Thank you.